Hello and welcome to 3 o'clock with SOC. My name is Alan Canacasco. I'm a public ally serving with SOC. I'm going to take a minute to say hello to a Spanish-speaking audience. Hola, mi nombre es Alan Canacasco Rubio. Soy un aliado público sirviendo con el Southside Organizing Center. Para escuchar el programa en español, por favor, marque el número 646-749-3122 y use el código de acceso a 779-328-221. I would want to just remind everyone that these shows are recorded and translated to Spanish and or English, and all of them can be accessed through our Facebook and YouTube platforms. Today's team is made up of Marisol in production and Travis on comments. As you can see, I'm not wearing my mask today because I'm working from home, just like the rest of our team. We continue to work for you. You can reach out to us at 414-672-8090 or by email at soc@socmilwaukee.org. And this information should be in the comments now. Okay, let's keep going. Please leave us your likes, your comments. Give us a share. We really want to hear from you. We want to hear how we're doing and want to hear if this is a resource folks are utilizing. I want to remind you that not all views and opinions necessarily reflect those of SOC. And finally, we would like to know, except just like leave us a comment. All right. Just to move on here. Topics for the rest of the week or leading on to next week. I do not know who is going to be here Monday, so I won't say anything for that. But Tuesday we have someone from the Milwaukee Christian Center. His name is Brian Stewart. He's a youth program manager, and we'll talk about youth program events through the Milwaukee Christian Center for Tuesday, which is our youth day. Wednesday, for a Spanish segment, we're going to have our usual guest, Pedro Hernandez from Legal Aid Society. And we'll probably be continuing to talking about evictions, how to get help with if you're facing an eviction through Legal Aid Society. Given that the moratoriums for both renters and mortgage insurance are coming to a close soon, he'll probably give us a little bit more information on that. I want to just quickly introduce our main guest for today. Today we have Dr. Sergio Gonzales, a professor of Latinx Studies in the Department of History and Languages, Literature and Culture at Marquette University, a historian of 20th century U.S. immigration, labor, and religion. His scholarship focuses on development of Latino communities in the U.S., particularly in the Midwest. He's an author of the book Mexicans in Wisconsin. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So if we can bring Sergio up to the screen. Hello, Sergio. Thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'm super excited that you're here. I've heard of you and seen you do some presentations in the past, and I don't know, I'm just super super excited here. I want to say that the presentation I attended UW Milwaukee, and maybe about a year ago, you gave a presentation on a book that had just been released about. I can't remember his name right now, but it's a associate or colleague of Hunter S. Thompson, a really close friend.
It was Oscar Zeta Acosta.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's just tell us a little bit about yourself. About the work that you do in the community. Jump into a little bit about Latinx history here in Wisconsin.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a Milwaukee native, born and raised. My parents are both from Jalisco, Mexico. I grew up here in Milwaukee, in the Milwaukee area, and then I did all of my higher education work at UW-Madison. So I was first middle school teacher. I did my first undergraduate work in secondary education, Spanish and history, and then I decided to go back to graduate school to get my master's and then my PhD in history. And so I spent some time in Madison finishing up my dissertation. And in the process, as I was working on that, I published a book called Mexicans in Wisconsin, which really draws from some of my research. And so as a historian of Wisconsin, historian of Latinos in the Midwest, I'm really interested in the ways in which people from across Latin America have come to this state, have come to this city, and have across the 20th century found ways to make this space their home. And the ways that they've often done that in the face of kind of abject discrimination, prejudice, and racism, and at times in the ways in which they, although they have felt like they are strangers or aliens or others in these spaces, despite those circumstances, they have found ways to make Milwaukee and Wisconsin a place that they can call home for themselves and for their families.
Right on. Tell me a little bit more about the process of. I've listened to one of your presentations. I found the story of you going to the archives very it's like that's something like that I would like you to share in this space. And that whole process of going to the archives, looking for information on Mexicans in Wisconsin. If you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm always interested in kind of the origin story of academics, why they decided to study the thing that they study. The reality is that when you go to graduate school, you're committing yourself to spend, 6, 7, 8 years of your life living in books and living in archives and digging through papers and trying to find ways to tell a story. And so when you make that commitment, you are saying, I want to really live within this topic, this theme, this history, wholeheartedly. And so when I went to graduate school after leaving the middle school classroom, I knew that I wanted to study something that mattered to me and something that mattered to the place where I was from, mattered to my family and to my community. And so when I started graduate school, I said, I want to understand and I want to tell the story, the histories of Latinos who have come to Wisconsin. So the first archival trip that I took as a graduate student, right? So the archives are the places where you dig into the documents, the oral histories, the newspapers, the institutional papers, all of those little pieces that you put together to try to understand the history of a community. My first time that I went to the archives was at the Milwaukee County Historical Society in the summer of, I think it was 2013. I was just a master's student at the time. And I went to the archivist and, I was doe-eyed and bushy-tailed. I was all excited to do this historical research. And I said, I'm a graduate student and I want to see everything that the Milwaukee County Historical Society has ever preserved on the histories of Latinos who have made their home in Wisconsin. And I thought when I made that request that it was going to be like multi-week or an entire summer spent at the Milwaukee County Historical Society digging through archives. Well, that archivist went into the back room. They were very nice, very polite. They went back there and they came back out to the central room of the archives and they had a few boxes and they said, this is everything. This is all we have. This is all we've preserved. And so at first I was stunned. I was stunned that this is all that the Milwaukee County Historical Society had saved after what was really a century-long history of Latinos moving to Wisconsin and settling here. But I was also afraid as a graduate student that I wouldn't have the documents that I needed to really tell this story. So I opened up one of those first boxes after I kind of got off that initial astounding feeling that I had, and I dug into that box. And one of the first documents that I found was this newspaper from the summer of 1987. And it was a magazine insert from the Milwaukee Journal called the Wisconsin Magazine. And on this cover of this full color page insert was an image, a picture of families leaving Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, of course, on Milwaukee's south side on Walker Point. And in that set of families was a picture of me as a young baby, just a few months old, in my parents' arms. And they were looking down at me and smiling, and our family was kind of surrounding us. And so there's this initial feeling of, wow, like I'm literally finding myself in the archives on my first archival trip. But then, after I got after that first set of fascinations, I looked at the actual image and I started to study it as a historian. And And I saw that at the bottom of the newspaper, it said the pulse of Hispanic Milwaukee. And so I got to thinking, what does it mean that the Milwaukee Journal is saying in 1987 that the heart of Milwaukee's Latino community are these Latino families leaving a church on a Sunday morning, and they're all happy and they're smiling. You can see that they're building a sense of self and a sense of community amongst each other. And so it was that first image that I encountered in the archives that got me to think about the ways in which religious spaces, faith spaces, have been places where Latinos have historically built community when they have needed to turn inward, right? When they have not found any space of belonging in the world around them. But also how religious spaces have across the 20th century been spaces where Latinos have built social movements for themselves, right? Built movements for sanctuary and for social and economic justice to push out against those boundaries.
Right on. Just following up of that, I guess if you can tell us anything more about, that religious piece and how important that has been for the community. Any pieces on that?
Yeah, so the religion, the aspect of religious life and faith is kind of a central way in which I understand Latino life. It's certainly not the only way, right? So I don't believe that all Latinos who have come to Wisconsin have centered their lives around their faith. But for many Latinos, it has been a place of cultural significance, of historical significance, and also, I think most importantly, a place of sanctuary. And I mean that in two different ways. I mean that in sanctuary in which they could kind of come to the church when they didn't feel a sense of respect, a sense of belonging in their workplaces, in the city streets, in social agencies, whatever it may have been across the 20th century. But by the end of the 20th century, churches actually became spaces of sanctuary for people fleeing war in their homes, where they were fleeing immigration and naturalization services, detention and deportation. They could actually turn to their churches as places for support. And so I'm really interested in the way in which Latinos not necessarily are religious people, right? I'm not a religious historian in that I study people's inner faith lives. I'm more interested in how they turn to churches as places, as institutions, to build up a sense of community and to build up social movements.
Thank you. Let's talk about labor. I think from my perspective, a huge reason as to why I thought of you and decided to bring you here. One, May 1st, which International Labor Day, and May 5th, which Cinco de Mayo kind of gets like a rap here in the United States, but it's misinterpreted. So first, let's go to the labor piece. What has been the labor? How have Latinos play a role here? Not only in labor in the way of say the labor movements, but from the beginning, starting to why were they hired here first, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, so my training is as an immigration historian, which makes sense because I study Latinos, but the other half of my training is in labor history. And I think you cannot understand the history of Latinos in the United States without understanding the history of their labor, of their work. That, again, I don't mean to say that all Latinos have come to Wisconsin merely because they were workers, because the questions of migration are very complicated, right? There are questions of refugees who have come from Cuba or from Central America and have not come to Wisconsin primarily because of their economic power. But for the majority and the overwhelming majority of Latinos who have come to this state, whether it's people from Mexico, people from the US-Mexico borderlands who are American citizens, people from Puerto Rico, and kind of everything in between, right? We think about the diversity of Latino experiences. Labor has often been kind of that connective tissue. And so as I tell my students in my classes, you cannot understand the Latino experience without understanding the way in which economics and questions of capital and questions of capital power influence the ways in which Latinos make their way to the state. And I always start when I have this conversation with los primeros, right? The arrival of the first large groups of Mexican descent people in the state of Wisconsin and Milwaukee began in the 1920s. These were Mexican industrial workers who were recruited to Milwaukee to come specifically for their work. And so for those of us who maybe know a little bit about Mexican history, we know that in the 1920s, Mexico was just kind of leaving a very disastrous revolutionary war. It left kind of the country in economic shambles, even though it was very important for the political future of the country. But there were a lot of people looking for economic opportunities. And so when American corporations went down into Mexico, places like Jalisco and Michoacan and Aguascalientes, and they offered them jobs, young men would take up those opportunities. So in the 1920s, young men in the central states of Mexico would board trains and come all the way up to Milwaukee, and they would work in tanneries and foundries and factories. Now, the thing is that when those companies recruited those workers and they used enganchistas, or people who went down there to hook workers, they never told those workers that they were often being recruited as strike breakers. They were bringing them up as scabs because Milwaukee at the time had a heavily unionized industrial workforce. And those companies like the Pfister and Vogel Tannery and Harnischfeger, instead of entering into collective bargaining in good faith with their white Milwaukee workers, would just go and find surplus strikebreakers down in Mexico. And so the first instance of Mexicanos, of Latinos arriving in Wisconsin, and the first kind of interactions that white Wisconsinites have with them is that these people are coming here to take our jobs. And we've probably heard that type of language a lot in the 21st century, but the point is to say that it has a long history, and that history is often by no cause and no merit of Latinos themselves, right? They've kind of been pushed into those situations by no means of their own. And throughout the 20th century, we have seen instances where Latinos have been forced to navigate kind of the complexities of labor, whether it's migrant workers in the 1950s or whether it's dairy workers today, right? I mean, these are live questions that have a century-long history in our state.
Right on. Tell us about, this is the start, like the first exposure to Latinos in labor here in Wisconsin. Now we go forward in time and we start seeing other movements, more Latinos fighting for their rights and based on their own labor. So if you can tell us a little bit about those movements that happened here in Wisconsin and yeah.
Yeah, so throughout the 40s and 50s, Latinos arrived from all parts of Latin America and from throughout the United States, right? So Puerto Rican migrant workers began arriving after World War II directly from the island, but also kind of through step migration from different places in the United States, like Chicago or Lorain, Ohio. And then in the 1950s, anywhere from 10 to 15,000 Tejano migrant farm workers come up from the U.S.-Mexico borderlands every single spring and summer to come and work in our fields, right? And so as those communities continue to grow throughout the 1940s and 1950s, even though they become a larger presence in the state, the treatment they're receiving in their workplaces and in their social spaces is not improving. And so Latinos across Wisconsin begin to mobilize and organize themselves. And oftentimes they're motivated by a number of different things. One, of course, beginning in the late 1950s and early 1960s, is a kind of a growing sense of social justice and civil rights movements across the United States. So there are two big ones that kind of influence what happens both in rural Wisconsin and in urban Wisconsin. The first, of course, is the civil rights movements in the U.S. South, which eventually make their way up north. Movements that probably a lot of your viewers are familiar with, whether that's Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and kind of in Milwaukee, the reverberations of that are Father Grappi and the Young Commandos. But they're also influenced by migrant farm workers that are organizing in California through the United Farm Workers, led by people like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and Lariat Long. And so in Milwaukee and across Wisconsin, you have groups often of young Mexican American, and Puerto Rican Wisconsinites who begin to organize themselves to push back against these kind of oppressive conditions in their workspaces. The most important and noticeable one begins in 1966 in rural Wisconsin, in Watoma, in the central part of the state. Migrant farm workers begin to organize themselves into a labor union. They call themselves Obreros Unidos. They're led by the great activist and leader who at that age, he's only in his young 20s, named Jesus Salas. And they organized in the summer of 1966, a very dramatic march from Watoma to Madison, the state's capital. And they call that march a march for respectability. So it's a labor union fighting for labor rights, but they're also fighting for basically their right to belong in the state and to be full human beings. And so that starts in 1966, and that movement kind of spreads across the state. And eventually in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there are kind of reverberations here in Milwaukee. So there's organizations like the Young Lords organization, which has a branch here in the city, the Latin American Union for Civil Rights, the Brown Berets, and so many different groups that start at that time period. And they're all fighting for labor rights, for welfare rights. They're fighting against police brutality, for housing rights, for a number of different things, ultimately to make the living and working conditions of Latinos in the state better.
Right on. Thank you. Just again, moving on in time, let's talk about a little bit about now. Particularly, say, like the work that Voces de la Frontera is doing, or any other organizations that have been fighting for workers' rights, particularly like Latinos, undocumented workers. If you can touch a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I always remind my students and audiences that Voces de la Frontera, even though they're an organization that begins in the 90s in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, but then also kind of begins here in Wisconsin in the late 90s and early 2000s. Even though they're a relatively new organization in that light, I think that they fit within the longer lineage, the longer ancestry of Latinos organizing themselves in the state of Wisconsin, right? And so the work that Voces de la Frontera does today, which is so important, right? I think they're one of the most important immigrant justice organizations in the United States, is really part of a longer history of Latinos advocating for themselves, organizing themselves, oftentimes doing it within their own communities, but just as importantly, looking for allies in important spaces across the state, across their cities, people who might not come from their same immigration background, the same ethnic or racial background, their same class background, but people who understand justice and understand that for Wisconsin to be a place that is welcome for everyone, that people need to work together, right? So one of the things that I'm really interested in my research, but also in the activism that I do, is in questions of kind of like inter-community collaboration. So how do people who don't necessarily mix together on their social functions or in their history still find ways to build bonds, to build coalitions, to advocate for justice together, to make the entire space of Wisconsin, of Milwaukee, a more welcoming space for everyone? Voces de la Frontera, of course, has been leading this fight for decades now. And I can see that they're going to continue to do it moving forward, because they really believe in kind of an intergenerational organizing structure, right? They're kind of working at all these different levels, working all the way from with high school students through their YES chapters in Milwaukee and Racine, all the way up to organizing across the state in workplaces and churches and anywhere they can really talk to people and connect with them.
Very cool. And we definitely had them here in the show. They're amazing. We definitely love to collaborate with them. You sit on their board, and you also co-founded an organization called Dane Sanctuary Coalition. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work and what you're doing there?
Yeah, so I do currently sit on both the Voces de la Frontera board and Voces de la Frontera Action, which is the 501c4, the kind of the political arm of the organization. I see that work today as kind of an outgrowth of some of the work that I've been doing for a little bit. When I was in Madison, I was involved in labor activism. So I was the co-president of my graduate worker union when I was a student and a student worker. I had been doing that work for a little bit. I had grown up in an immigration and labor activist family, and I had kind of learned at my mom's hip when I was growing up, kind of the importance of activism and using our voices when we have it to speak up, not just for ourselves, but for our communities. In 2016 and 2017, there was an opportunity to kind of put some of all that academic work that I've been doing to a better use. And so I'm sure that you and a lot of our viewers remember that after the 2016 election, after the election of President Trump, a lot of us were kind of left wondering, what are we going to do? And I remember being at a community meeting in Madison after that election. And it was a community meeting that was organized by faith leaders in Madison. And the majority of the faith leaders were white faith leaders. And they said to the Latino community, what do you want from us? What do you need from us? And the Latino community in Madison kind of said with one voice, well, one of the things that you can do as a religious community is sanctuary. Open up your church spaces as places for respite, but also as places to build organizing capacity. And in my dissertation research, I had written an entire chapter on the history of the sanctuary movement in Milwaukee in the 1980s. Milwaukee played a really important role in the sanctuary movement for Central American asylees in the late 20th century. And so I thought to myself, well, it's incumbent upon myself. It's important for me to take all that research that I've been working on, combine it with my activist energies, and to help build this capacity for sanctuary. And so it's from that position that in 2017, I helped found the Dane Sanctuary Coalition and became an organizer for the organization. We would go to different congregations, both churches and synagogues. We would talk about the importance of immigration activism, and just as importantly, the importance of religious organizations, both clergy and lay people, to step forward on behalf, side by side, with their immigrant sisters and brothers at a time when they felt like they were being attacked after the 2016 election.
Very cool. And yeah, that sounds like amazing work for sure. Let's talk about, to close it out, tell us a little bit about your book. Tell us where we can find it. And if you can give us a little more information about your second project, which I believe is titled Strangers No Longer. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So my first book that I published when I was in graduate school, I took a little bit of I want to say break because I was still writing my dissertation. But while I was working on that, I wrote a book for the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. It's called Mexicans in Wisconsin. I'm gonna turn around and grab it off the bookshelf here. Real smooth, like
Yes.
Mexicans in Wisconsin through the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. It's a real short book, right? So the thing that I always emphasize is this book is like 130 pages. It is a brief introduction, not to the history of Mexicans in Wisconsin, but to histories of Mexicans in Wisconsin. This is a collection of different stories, and it is just a kind of a beginning to begin telling this story of Mexicans who have come to call Wisconsin their home. I published it for a number of different reasons. One, it was a great opportunity to take all of this like highfalutin, sometimes heady academic work that I was working on as a dissertation, and make it more accessible for a larger community. Because what's the point of working on academic research if you can't share it with people? And so I had this opportunity to write this book, which is written for a popular audience. It doesn't have footnotes, really. It's really accessible. And so I really encourage people to check it out if they're interested in learning a little bit more about the history of Mexicans in Wisconsin and across the state, not just in Milwaukee. They can grab it at their local bookseller. You can find it online. Just, search Mexicans in Wisconsin and Gonzales and you'll find it. That was my first book. The second book that I'm working on right now is I'm taking my dissertation and I'm turning it into kind of a more traditional history book. And that's a history of Latinos, not just Mexicans, across the state of Wisconsin. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's an opportunity for me to delve into the way in which religious spaces have been places for community formation. And so the book begins in the 1920s and it goes all the way to the 1990s. And I look at the history of Mexicanos, of Mexican Americans, of Chicanos, of Puerto Ricans, of Central Americans, of Cubans, who have all come to Wisconsin for a number of different reasons, but the ways in which they have turned to their churches as a place of solace when they needed it most. Very
cool. Well, I think that would be our time. Sergio, I really appreciate you coming here. I really appreciate all the information. It was a great interview, and I personally learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and thank you for all these wonderful talks that you guys provide. They're fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully we can find another time we can have you back on. Maybe
Absolutely.
For a segment.
I'd love it. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Sergio, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. That was Dr. Sergio Gonzales. He is a professor of history, Latinx history at Marquette University. And we'll move on with the show here. We are going to play our COVID resource here in a sec. I do not know what we're gonna have for you today, so we're gonna have a video that Marisol chose.
The more infectious the disease is, the higher the proportion of the population that has to be protected and before we get to herd immunity. So for coronavirus, we think that it's probably around 70% of people would need to have immunity before the rest of the group would be protected. Herd immunity is the idea that even though one individual may not have gotten protected from an infection or may not have had that infection, the more people in their herd or group that do have protection to that infection, the less likely they are to get it. So when the majority of people have protection from an infection, the herd is less likely to transmit that infection.
There are lots of examples of viruses that we have achieved some level of herd immunity to. One example on the far end of success is smallpox, where we were able to fully eradicate the disease. Immunity to the coronavirus can be achieved either through natural infection or through a vaccine. They don't have to be two separate things. We can have some immunity from natural infection and also some immunity from a vaccine. In most places in the world, we think that level of natural infection right now is still only 20% or less. And so we still have a long way to go. And certainly the fastest and safest way to get there is through a vaccine.
Coronavirus is here with us. We're not going to be able to eradicate it. It seems very unlikely. And it is not inevitable that we all have to get this infection. That is not inevitable. There are a lot of reasons to be hopeful that we will be able to develop a vaccine and can get prevention that way if we can hold out a little bit longer.
All right, perfect. I was telling Marisol that was a great pick. Okay, yeah, and as we know, we have developed a vaccine. And if you need to get vaccinated, there's resources in the chat about where you can get vaccinated. If you need to get tested, we have the resources in the or in the comments rather, where you can get tested. Please get vaccinated. That vaccine has been developed. We have the means to reach a herd immunity through vaccination, and we're looking to get to a 70-80% mark in order for us to have some sort of normalcy. I am vaccinated. I believe most of my team, my crew is vaccinated, so please get that vaccination. Let's move on here with the show. My community resource for today is on energy assistance through the Milwaukee County. So if you live in the Milwaukee County, you are eligible, or you can be eligible depending on your income, for energy assistance. There is, due to the pandemic, there is a flyer that we're gonna share here in a sec, or if we can share the flyer, please. Here, there we go. This will be, and it provides you a little bit of information on what are how to get this energy assistance. There are some links in the comments that will also help you with that. There is income restrictions. You have to fill out an application. All applications are due on, or if you want assistance with an application and you have to call directly to them, you have to do it by May 15. Now you can skip that process and do an application on your own, and just send it to them. If you do need assistance, there's also community advocates who are helping folks out review those applications. But all applications have to be submitted by May 15. So if you know you need any assistance, don't hesitate to fill that out. And again, we'll provide we have the links on the chat. You could also contact SOC if you need any assistance. So yeah, please do that if you need it. If you need more information, if you're unsure if you qualify due to your income, just that never hurts to double check, make sure. You can reach out to us. We'll provide you with that information. Yeah, okay. Well, that was the community resource of the day. We'll move on with the reminders for the rest of the week. Tuesday, we're going to have Brian Stewart. He's a youth program manager at the Milwaukee Christian Center, and he'll be here to talk about youth programming. And just tell us about what his organization offers for the youth, what folks can or youth kids do over the summer with their organization. And Wednesday we're gonna have Pedro Hernandez, and Pedro is he's an attorney at Legal Aid Society, and he'll be talking a little bit about evictions, eviction help from his organization. Let's just say our final goodbyes. I really just want to emphasize, folks, get vaccinated, and yeah, I'll leave you with our survey promo. Please fill out our survey. Let us know what you want to see, how we can improve, and thank you for joining us today.
Has this live forum been informative and useful to you? What part of the forum could be improved or changed to make it better? Please take our quick survey that's located in the comments section so that we can keep 3 o'clock with SOC going for residents. Thank you for tuning in.